Hello and welcome to Zero Trust World 2025. CyberRisk TV is here, recording live from the Caribe Royale in Orlando, Florida. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, and joining me for our next interview is Seamus Lennon, VP of Operations EMEA at ThreatLocker. How are you doing, Seamus?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so it's this is my first time at Zero Trust World. I wasn't aware of this before a few months ago, but what an operation!
Yeah.
I love the structure of the conference. The fact that you've got it's not just talks.
No.
You've got certification that you're doing. You've got labs, so there's hands-on stuff. Some really interesting looking keynotes. Quite the conference.
Yeah, we don't really call it a conference as such because a conference is people just speaking to you and you sit there and
Right.
listen. We classify it as a multi-day cybersecurity educational event.
Yeah.
And that's what it is. Because we offer the labs and we offer all of the insights to hacking labs and everything else, people can learn from it and learn how to implement what we call zero trust.
Yeah, excellent stuff. Speaking of zero trust, right there in the name, there's a lot to talk about with zero trust. But from your perspective, how important has it been in mitigating risk? Like, it seems like the principle of least privilege, which is what I think of when I think zero trust, that idea has been around for a long time. And, I think it took a couple of decades before somebody really got more specific about it. Okay, like this is what it looks like when you apply it to systems and networks and things like that.
Yeah, and look, the principle of zero trust has been around for a long time. So if you take something like application allow listing, it's been around for decades.
Yeah.
The issue with application allow listing, it was always time consuming and tedious to implement and maintain and keep on top of. So a lot of organizations just wouldn't implement it. It just took up too much time. So we've evolved, and ThreatLocker offers obviously application allow listing, which is done in an easy, manageable fashion. And once it's easy and manageable, then people can adopt it. So the true principle of zero trust, as you say, is least privilege. So it's least privilege not just at the endpoint, but as users using applications and what they can and cannot do. So, and that's how we sort of mitigate the risks. So it's about knowing what you run in your environment and then control that. So risk is obviously about having controls in place and then accepting what you cannot control.
Yeah.
But if you can control pretty much everything,
Or being planned for.
Yeah, or
planning for what you
plan
can
for
do.
that
Yeah.
risk, yes, and accept that risk, and that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I often say there's a lot of good ideas in security that kind of get burned and discarded just because maybe they were implemented badly. Maybe vendors went in the wrong direction with it. It wasn't that like NAC, for example, is another example here where not a bad idea. But unless you have a plan for how you're going to implement it enterprise-wide, it becomes this kind of niche thing just for the wireless or just for the guest network or something like that. And that's kind of what happened to allow listing, is it became something you'd use on a kiosk PC or a payment terminal, never a developer's PC or an engineer's PC.
Never. You can't lock down a developer's PC because they're God.
Yeah.
So,
and they're the ones getting hacked.
And they're always the ones
they
getting
have all the keys to the kingdom.
Time and time again.
Yeah.
And we see that all the time. But you're right. Applying that in a controlled manner across the organization, again, has been always typically difficult. So, but if you think about it logically, what connects the networks? It's endpoints.
Yeah.
So if you just take the simple principle of locking down the endpoint, because realistically, that's the path of least resistance. So as an attacker getting into an organization, they're not going to go after the main infrastructure. They're going to go after users. Because that's the way in. It's the easy way in. If you can lock down that device, regardless, well then you're stopping that movement.
Yeah. So. I do a lot of advisory work with enterprises, with defenders, and a lot of vulnerability management. So one of the things I want to talk about is reducing risk from the software here. And I don't know if this is something you've noticed as well, but I was on a call with an organization the other day, and they're still using spreadsheets. They're pulling stuff out into spreadsheets, still doing vulnerability management in Excel. And I was like, why don't you just share your screen? Let me look at some of the data that you're dealing with. Because it was a typical call where it's overwhelming. There's too much. We're having trouble prioritizing. And you can clearly see from the name of the asset that it was a web server. But Cups is installed and running. Like,
Yeah.
why do you have printer software on your web servers?
Yeah.
You know, like,
Yeah.
well, and the answer is because Red Hat Enterprise Linux, this is just what comes
with it.
with
Yeah,
the
yeah.
default.
Yeah.
They've done no hardening, you know, haven't removed any unused or unnecessary software. So of course their vulnerability management is a nightmare because they've got everything installed.
Yeah.
So is that something you see a lot? Is that kind of a step you go through with customers where, you know, before we get into, you know, allow listings a lot easier if you remove all that unnecessary stuff?
100%. So, great part of our solution is we utilize what we call a learning mode. So we learn what runs on the environment. Now, that's great, but like you say, there's all these pre-built-in applications that users just don't need, servers don't need, but they're there already. So what we can do is we can do a look-back period and say, right, if something hasn't executed in 6 weeks, chances are it's not needed.
Yeah.
Get rid of it. Take the controls away, stop it from ever executing in the environment. So, again, and the funny thing is about vulnerability management software is, obviously when that spreads out around the network, it's scanning every port, looking for those vulnerabilities against those ports and identify those ports. We use what we call network control to lock down access to only devices that need access to the ports and services.
Right.
Right? So we were saying it's object-based policy. So I had a customer of mine, and they were going through this red team test. And as part of that red team test, they had to go through the vulnerability management. So what happened was the company came in, they plugged the device into the network, and they did a full scan. They said, look, we'll be back in 2 weeks. We'll have a full vulnerability report. It'll be very extensive, very, very extensive. 2 weeks later, they came back with 2 sheets with the name of the devices, and that was it. Network control had locked down access to every single port.
Yeah.
Now, what he said to the actual IT director was, you guys must be cheating. We must be on the wrong
Yeah.
network. He's like, no, that's just the way it should be. So zero trust is obviously even at the port level, only allowing
Yeah.
what needs to run. So regardless of what vulnerabilities are on the devices, nobody can actually take advantage of those vulnerabilities because
Right.
they can't see them. So, and look, vulnerabilities are always going to be there. You're never going to be 100% secure.
Yeah.
There's always going to be a hole somewhere in a certain piece of software. But if you can control the software and control the access to that software, you can sort of secure that environment as well.
It's kind of a no-brainer principle because less and less do we have local assets that we need to get to. You know, like everybody kind of dumps on free Wi-Fi or coffee shop Wi-Fi
yeah.
as super dangerous. But almost every, like I used to systematically try and scan those networks when I was on them, just to see how people would configure them. And in 99.9% of cases, they've ticked that box that says client isolation, which means you get on the coffee shop Wi-Fi, you can get to the internet. That's it.
That's it. Yeah,
You
yeah.
can't talk to anybody else because there's no need to.
Yeah.
Like, there's not a local printer at the coffee shop you're printing to. You know, there's not a local file server that you're connecting to. There's no need for any of that. So, in a way, coffee shops adopted zero trust first.
They did. Well, most of them did. But
Yeah.
the other side of that is, like, if you think about as a result of COVID, most people went into a remote working.
Yeah.
And still today, it's a hybrid workforce.
Yeah.
Most people are working at home on a home broadband connection, which doesn't have the same security level that an office network would have. And if you
But
think
that's
about,
part of your corporate network now.
but that's it. and what you're doing is you're VPNing into that corporate network
Yeah.
and exposing it. But here's the funny thing. When we talk about vulnerabilities, it's not just vulnerabilities in endpoints, but it's vulnerabilities in everything. So, I mean, you know, if you think about a home broadband connection,
IoT.
smart TVs, Wi-Fi enabled fridges, freezers, you name it, all
Yeah.
of those IoT devices are potential access to your network.
Yeah.
Potential access to your device, which is potential access to your corporate network. And that's where we always say it's the path of least resistance. So, I mean, most home users are not going to go patching their fridge or patching this and patching everything.
Right.
They just don't. So, and again, it's sort of that way in as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how those two worlds have collided. And speaking of all those consumer IoT devices, you know, I think supply chain is another challenge here, where it's not necessarily even installed packages in a lot of these cases, and we see the attackers have realized the benefit of going after supply chain
yes.
because instead of having to target a single organization, you know, now if I target an NPM package,
Yep.
you know, something a developer is going to download and incorporate into whatever application they're building, I can hit everybody that uses
Exactly.
that one package.
Exactly. Like, was it last year or the year before we seen 3CX, the voice over IP service? That update was intercepted through that supply chain attack. So instead of the actual software updating, it pushed out a ransomware to the voice. SolarWinds Orion, that was probably one of the most notorious one.
Yeah.
You know, and a lot of government agencies use SolarWinds Orion, but again, that was pushed out a false update to attack ransomware. And so they know rather than attacking individual users, go after the main ones. And supply chain risk is a huge risk. But again, when we're talking about supply chain, like how do we mitigate against supply chain risks?
Yeah.
Well, again, apply the principles of zero trust, which is least privilege. So, okay, I have an application running on my device. What does that application need to do?
Exactly.
What data does it need to access? What other applications does it need to interact with? What network or internet connections does it need to access? And by applying those zero trust policies and principles to the applications themselves. So if, in the case of SolarWinds Orion, basically what happened was when that patch came out, it went off to a site in New Jersey, I believe it was,
Right.
to download that payload. Well, if you had said SolarWinds can run on my device, but it can only reach out to SolarWinds,
Right,
that's it.
exactly.
It's not going to happen. So again, it's applying those principles as well.
Yeah, we find in a lot of these cases that companies that are really focused on locking down outbound privileges, outbound network privileges, like with Log4j as well, with Log4Shell. Who cares if the exploit can get in? But if your servers shouldn't be able to browse to anywhere on the internet,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah,
They should be locked down to just what they need.
Yeah. And that's what most organizations say. Well, look, I've no outbound connections or outbound ports open on my servers. I mean, Exchange vulnerability. 2016 Exchange vulnerability. You could inject directly into IIS, scripts for it to execute. We did come across this with one of our clients where a batch file had tried to execute on the Exchange server. Now, obviously we're applying zero trust to that, so when it tried to execute, it got blocked and denied. The IT admins got alerted that it got blocked and denied. So basically they took that batch script and then executed it in a controlled manner, and it just caused havoc. It caused havoc.
Yeah.
Basically, in the Exchange server, it replaced the Outlook address book to a actual payload.
Oh, wow.
So every time somebody opened up Outlook, it would download the new global address book, but instead of doing that, it was actually downloading the payload.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that one.
Yeah. Very simple, very easy.
Yeah.
But again, that was a vulnerability within Exchange.
Yeah.
Now look, there's certain things you can block outbound access, but if you're using an on-premise Exchange server, how is anybody on a remote device able to access it? It has to have that connection.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's some of these are tough. Exchange, an Exchange vulnerability or set of Exchange vulnerabilities shut down one of Rackspace's entire business lines.
Yep.
Yeah, their whole Exchange hosting business with over 10,000 customers, they just moved them all over to Microsoft 365.
Yep.
Yeah, we're done.
Yeah. And that is the
Let
the thing.
Microsoft deal with this.
Yeah, it's their problem, not ours. Yeah. And look, as I say, there's always going to be risks in supply chain.
Yeah.
You know that way. And when you think about risks and vulnerabilities, like if you go back to, let's say, WannaCry 2017, that was the Eternal Blue vulnerability, which was the most,
which is still hanging out there.
most notorious ransomware. It was hidden there for a while. Nobody knew about the vulnerability, but once it got out, that was it. Now, in 2017, if you look at CVEs that were recorded that year, there was like 14,000 CVEs.
Yeah.
Okay. Fast forward to 2024, there's 40,000 CVEs.
Yeah.
So although companies have adopted like secure development and being security aware, even in the development cycle, there's still a huge amount of vulnerabilities out there. So.
And that's a great point. So I talk about this, again, with this advisory I do with enterprises, I talk about this constantly about how you should be thinking about broad mitigations that are going to prevent those vulnerabilities from being exploited before you even know they exist.
Yeah.
So again, like outbound controls, not allowing systems to talk to anywhere, not allowing, shutting down ports of software that's not being used. A lot of what you guys are doing are these
controlling the applications themselves.
This is almost part of vulnerability management in a way.
Yeah, it's a very simple when you think about it, the methodology, and once you apply it, you're literally mitigating against 90% of the risks that are out there.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us today, Seamus. I've enjoyed this conversation. I learned about a new exchange vulnerability I was never aware of. That was really interesting. And to access all the Cyber Risk TV content from Zero Trust World 2025, you can visit securityweekly.com/ZTW. And stick around. We'll be back in a bit with more interviews.
Thanks
again,
much.
Seamus.
Thank you.